As I started this hem alteration on a multi-layer gown for my niece, I realized that there was a lot of different techniques that would come into play that I could share with my sewing friends. Let's get started. Here I have the gown supported at my cutting table, but also then on my ironing board brought up close. I had determined that I needed to take off about 2 inches at the center front. I pressed it up as I told you in that first photograph, and I'm starting on the lowermost layer of this 3-layer prom dress. The bottommost layer is satin, and then the upper 2 layers are chiffon. They're done with a narrow hem, but that would really be a 3-step process. So at least for the bottom 2 layers, I'm going to do a rolled hem. Since it's lightweight, I'm doing a 2-thread rolled hem, which means that I have the needle in, and the right needle, because I want it to be lighter weight. To do a 2-thread rolled hem, I have to put this plug-in adapter on the upper looper. So I'm using the right needle because I want it skinny, and the lower looper. My wonderful Elma 704 serger, it's kind of old. It does do a cover hem, which I never use, but I love this serger, and I've got it set at negative differential feed. Now on the differential feed, what that means is that the back feed dogs are pulling out faster than the front feed dogs are feeding it in, creating a taut, T-A-U-T situation, and not as close of a stitch length as you might think. As I work then, what I'm doing is just aiming for that pressed up line with the needle. I think it's worth sharing that, do you see that I have one hand in back, one hand in front, and I'm even giving it a little tug as it feeds through. Again, my eye is on that pressed line, and I know this is not the shiny side of the satin, but that's what they have as the outside of it. The satiny side is towards the body, so this is right side up. I pinned up how much it needed to be shortened in the front, and since this is a train-like hemline, I just took that much off all the way around. I will end this at the very center back. And I also tested my stitch as I began to make sure that I had my settings as I wanted them. You can see then the effect that I'm getting. It's a little bit of a fluted effect, but that'll be fine at the bottom of this dress, just fine. Also note that the stitch is not real close. I'm not getting any whiskers, but it's not a really, really close covered rolled hem all with thread. It's just not, and I'm using regular polyester thread that I had on hand. One thing I find I have to teach new sewers is that you can only go so far. I bet I'm not doing more than 6 inches at a time, and then I have to stop and reposition my hands. The very most important place to have your hands when you're at the serger is my right hand needs to be right underneath here, making sure that I don't have any extra fold of fabric going in there, because a serger cuts before it sews, and you can make an unfixable mistake. So under here is where these fingers belong. This is the very best situation with a screw hook in the ceiling to hang the gown up free, so it's not hung up on anything. See here that each layer was longer. Now, do not count on this being uniform on the gown that was made. See how much little difference there is here. So I figure if I take off from the original the amount I took off on the bottom layer, and each further layer out was a little bit longer, it should just work out. But I don't want to just do that without double checking. Here's a pin that I put in while she had it on. Where's that pin? Right there. So you can see, and she wants it to drag the floor some. I'm always going to opt for too long rather than too short. The kids just want them to drag the floor, and this has a train effect in the back. So I'm definitely going to make it longer rather than shorter. With the outermost layer pinned up out of the way, and I love this tool, this Clover 9506. It's $14.50, but this moving part is going to stay where I put it. So if I were to measure here what I pinned, that's going to be more like 2.5 inches that would come off. But you can see compared to the bottommost layer, it's a good, healthy 1/2 inch to 3/4 of an inch longer. Therefore, whatever this measures from the pin down is what I'm going to pin in again and do that same amount off by pressing it, measuring, pressing it up first, and then serging it off. On something like that where it's a huge difference between how much time it would take, and if you're doing this for hire, then go for the easiest way, because in most cases they're not going to care. You can certainly ask the customer, but I'd go for the quicker way because it just really doesn't matter. And yeah, that's what I would do. And again, do you see the situation I have here? The weight of the garment is supported on my cutting table, and I've moved my ironing board up close. So this was a $550 gown. She said she got it for $100 on sale. Again, do you see the situation I have here? The weight of the garment is supported on my cutting table. Just amazes me what things cost, but it is really nicely made. All 3 layers are done with French seams, which means it's a totally encased seam. Instead of stitching right sides together, the wrong sides were stitched together, trimmed close, then turned, encasing that seam allowance and stitching again. That's a French seam. This is a very center back of it, and do you see what I'm aiming for? As long as I'm getting off 2.5 inches and I'm creating a smooth curve, that's all I can deal with right now. But that's my goal. All right, this goes to prove that hems as they're put into gowns isn't necessarily done really well. Do you see how much more I have turned up here than here? But to have this be a smooth line, that's just what it has to be. So I let the situation be the boss instead of an exact hem. That just means that it wasn't very straight to begin with, so I can make it better. Forgive my ironing board, it is clean. It's just what happens when you use an ironing surface. I'm now starting to serge the middle layer. And so do you see I started out here and now I'm coming in to my pressed line, and in that area I can test and figure out my stitch settings. I might want to go a little bit closer stitch length. So let's look at it. Well, I'm getting some whiskers, and the amount of whiskers that you get is totally going to depend on what grain of the fabric you're on. When you're on the straight grain part, you're going to have more whiskers than when you're on the bias part. I think I'm going to closen up my stitch. So that means I brought it down to 1.5. And let me see what that looks like. And I started at the center back. That's much better. So do you see, here's what it looks like. Still not stacked on each other. And no, I'm not using woolly nylon. I don't happen to have that color. I don't do a whole lot of this kind of work, so it would be silly to have stock of woolly nylon in a bunch of different colors. Here then is a comparison of the rolled hem. This is a 2-thread rolled hem edge that I'm doing versus what was on the dress to begin with. I think it's worth discussing again that I have chosen to use a 2-thread rolled hem. That means I have 1 needle, and I chose the right needle, and the lower looper. You see here on my machine for rolled hem 2, it's program number 8. This tells me to use the right set of needles. Number 2 tells me to have my blade up and this little adapter on the upper looper. So what happens is that the thread that you see on the top is really the lower looper thread being lifted to the top. If I have just always had a 2, 3, 4 thread serger, and I would always opt to sew with 2 threads rather than 3 threads. If this were a 3-thread rolled hem, the lower looper would be so tight it was just laying in a straight row anyway, and it would be the upper looper thread that's wrapping around the edge. If I had wanted to use woolly nylon on this, I would then have put the woolly nylon in the lower looper, because that's what gets lifted to the top, whereas normally in a serged edge it's the upper looper that shows on the top. Again, I just love 2-thread capabilities, and on such a lightweight fabric, why would I want to put more thread in the hem than is absolutely necessary? The other thing to point out on a rolled hem is that the stitch is being formed over this skinny little pin. Do you see it back here? This skinny little pin instead of the fat finger, which has been rotated down. The other thing on the serger is when you're doing a rolled hem, you want fabric left in there to roll. So do you see I have my cutting width all the way to the right? In other words, this, I'm not going to show you this, but this moving blade moves against a fixed blade. And you can move that fixed blade right or left. So I've got it all the way to the right, so it's not cutting off much fabric. That means that fabric is rolling within this rolled hem. That's why I opt and love a 2-thread rolled hem. Now for this last outermost layer, which is obviously the most important, I'm not just going to trust to take off. Yeah, I've got to really let it hang here and pull it out where it's all the same together, and make sure that the outermost layer is a little bit longer than the inner 2 layers. See, the shorter, longer, now a little bit longer yet. But do you see, I took off 2 inches, or 2.5, and then 2, and now look how much there is. There's like 4 inches there. So that tells me that the outermost layer was a lot longer than the middle and the under layer to begin with. If this were a client for an alteration, at this point I would be curious enough that I would want to have her back in and put it on her to actually determine where I wanted this outermost layer to be hemmed at. So I'm going to call my niece here and have her come back in and try this on again, so that I can make sure that I put a row of pins in exactly where I want this finished outermost layer to be hemmed at. The fact that is painfully clear to me at this point is how unevenly done this hem was initially in the first place. And most consumers would never have realized that in the first place. It would not have kept them from buying this $550 prom dress. But as a dressmaker, I want to make it the very best I can. A gal can always change her mind, and instead of putting it back on my niece, what I've decided to do is pin the 3 layers together as they seem they want to hang together, do you see? And then at that point on the hem, you see the bottom layer, the middle layer? Now I'm putting a pin in where I want the lower outermost layer to be hemmed, and I'm going to do that all the way around. You have to understand, you don't know in the first place if each 3 of these layers were cut with the same pattern. I don't even know if there's the same amount of fullness in each of them. I could check that by what I've cut off, but it's not going to change anything. In the end, it hangs as it hangs. It's all going to be moving independently anyway. So I'm just going to sit here on the floor and put in this row of pins, and then when I get to the ironing board, just kind of smooth it out, going for longer rather than shorter. Here's a very good example. Look right here how much I'm taking off versus over here. That's at least an inch difference. So one thing is you've got to put in plenty of pins, and see how each pin I go in, out, in, out. Right here, do you see, this is at one of the seams, and they're not seams that are lining up. The way this seam is pulling up, I can tell you that that's the straight grade. And so then this gets biased, so that's why this is hung out longer. But right here, do you see, I have virtually no hem to take off. Here, as I get back to the train part of it, look how very, very much more length there is to the outermost layer than the top layer. I think that's kind of silly. I'll make it a little bit longer than I've made the rest of it, but yeah, and you just have to pull out your pins and say, okay, if I were pressing or stitching a line along there, would that be even? Would it be a nice gentle arc? The other thing I have to do is keep going up to make sure that I'm pulling it straight down and not over to an angle. That would change things. So I'm not looking just at the bottommost layer. I've got to be looking all the way up. Here, look at this. Even on a $550 dress, look at this. I don't know if that's happened just in the trying on or whatever, but, and look how long that stitch length is. This was not a well done hem at any rate. Do you see that pull there? Yucca. The truth of the matter is that this was so uneven to begin with. Look, nothing here, that much there, and that much there, to still be approximately an inch longer than the under layers. I can assure you that they were not cut from the same pattern pieces. I don't even have seams in the same locations. The other thing that I can assure you of is that this dress was not allowed to hang before it was hemmed. The areas where it's bias, where it stretches out the most, have much more length of hem in them versus the places that are more straight grain have much less hem. So this was hemmed before it was allowed to hang. Dressmakers are taught to let a dress hang before they hem it. My next step then for this outermost layer is to lay it out on my cutting table, and I've got lots of pins in, but now I just want to look and see, do I have a nice smooth arc of pins? That's what I'm looking for next. Right here between this one and this one, do you see how this one seems to come up a little bit? So I'm going to move it down. You can really see right here how it goes from where it was bias and it grew longer to where it's more straight grain, and I can tell that by feeling it, and I'm not going to take off hardly any. Right in here, see, here's a seam and I'm taking off hardly any, and then all of a sudden it came up to this much off, this much off, this much off. I'm always going to err for making it longer rather than shorter. So I'm going to move this pin down a little bit. All right, so this is real curious. This cannot be right. So obviously, as I look here, this was wrong. Sometimes you just have to use your common sense, right? So if this is the center back, do you see as I eyeball this up that I've got it pinned, pins in at about the same depth as it goes up? So that looks good. So here I have it draped over my table, so I'm making sure that I have the same amount pinned off at each of the side seams, and again that my row of pins is looking like a smooth arc. And if in doubt, believe me, I made it longer. There's nothing worse than getting something too short. You can always shorten it, but you can't lengthen it. I think this looks good. Now, the truth of the matter is when you put it on a person, they move, they wiggle, they breathe. I'm going to go ahead and press this and go for it. And with the fullness to this, I don't think that I could do a narrow hem like this very well, so I'm for sure going to do a rolled hem again. And I'm going to double check that I've got plenty of thread. Sure enough, this is right at the center front of the gown, but see, as I open that up, I do have a nice scoop there at the center front. All right, I checked and I thought I had plenty of thread, but all of a sudden, and I'm not even where this is on the garment, I ran out of serger thread. So let's go through a few serger things. I do have another one that will work. It's not exactly the same, but this is the hem of a full dress, so I'm not going to panic. I have another video explaining this, but I need to fix the looper, and loopers are always threaded before needles. Needle threads wrap around the loopers. So if I don't want to have to totally unthread the needle, all I have to do is raise my presser foot, get this needle thread coming straight from the eye of the needle out, so it's not wrapped around the lower looper. Then I can rethread the lower looper. Oh crap, this isn't right, and I wish I had tested it. So I'll need to take this out. I believe it was the lower looper I probably didn't have snugged all the way back in between these tension discs. I'm going to test it now, as I should have done in the first place. All right, it is the needle thread that holds serging together. So if I get hold of this needle thread right here and pull, it should all come out. And voila, it did. So here's where I started and stopped, and only me and all of you who watch this will ever know that that happened. That's not going to be visible. Down at the hem, I'll get this tail taken care of. It'll be okay. Don't panic. So here's how it looks after pressing, before pressing. And right in here somewhere is where my thread broke and I had to start over twice. And I don't think if I didn't exactly point that out to you, you'd never know where that was. And here's my final hem. I'm happy. It looks pretty and graceful, and the outermost layer is longer than the other layers all around. It has a little bit of fluff out to it, and I think it looks great. All right, I started this at 11 o'clock, and it is now 10 till 2. So that is almost 3 hours. 2010, when we were doing dressmaking at my shop, we were charging $20 an hour. For work that I do today, I charge $30 an hour. So 12, 22. So that's 3 hours. So if I were doing this for hire, it would have been $90. And most people won't think that it was worth that. But it took me over a half hour to even just serge around the lowermost edge. I have 1 hour in that outermost layer. And on that note, I just measured what I cut off, and it was 432 inches around. 100 inches is full. So this dress, even though it hangs skinny, is very full around the lower edge. Time is money. What does a carpenter make? This is as skilled of labor as a carpenter. So that's why I'm not doing alterations for hire. I do them for family and maybe occasionally for a friend. And in that case, I usually just ask them to give a donation to a cause in which I believe. Right now, that's Days for Girls or Judicial Watch, something like that. But it takes a lot to do an alteration, especially on multiple layer garments. And I would say circumference of the garment would definitely play a part, because the further around it is at the bottom, the more work, the longer time that it takes. I hope you've learned something from this. Thanks for coming to my channel. I hope you subscribe.